Okay, hello everybody. I'm Persis Karim, Director for the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies at San Francisco State University. And I'm very excited to host a conversation today with Yassamin Ansari, who's a city council member from the city of Phoenix, Arizona, and Kiana Kazemi. And I'm gonna read their bios in a second. But before we start, I want to offer two important things. One is a land acknowledgement that the campuses of San Francisco State University on the San Francisco Peninsula and North Bay are located within the occupied territories of the Ramaytush Ohlone and the coastal Miwok, who along with the Southern Pomo are organized as the Federated Indians of Graton Rancheria. And I'm really happy that down the street from me, a garden plot that was used as a community garden was just given back to the Ohlone tribe that's local to this area. So it's kind of cool to see land being returned. It's, it's a small garden plot, but.
Is it the Ashby plot?
Yeah.
I live a 2-minute walk from there.
Oh, you should come over because I live 2 minutes from there too.
Great. I would love that.
And I'm also going to read a poem by Wendell Berry called A Vision, because it's also National Poetry Month. And I can't think of a more important reason to read poetry than to celebrate Earth Day and Earth Month. And this is called A Vision. If we will have the wisdom to survive, to stand like slow-growing trees on a ruined place, renewing, enriching it, if we will make our seasons welcome here, asking not too much of earth or heaven, then a long time after we are dead, the lives our lives prepare will live there. Their houses strongly placed on the valley sides, fields and gardens rich in the windows. The river will run clear as we will never know it, and over it birdsong like a canopy. On the levels of the hills will be green meadows, stock bells and noon shade. On the steeps where greed and ignorance cut down the old forest, an old forest will stand, its rich leaf fall drifting on its roots. The veins of forgotten springs will have opened. Families will be singing in the fields. In their voices, they will hear a music risen out of the ground. They will take nothing from the ground they will not return, whatever the grief at parting. Memory native to this valley will spread over it like a grove, and memory will grow into legend, legend into song, song into sacrament. The abundance of this place, the songs of its people and its birds will be health and wisdom and indwelling light. This is no paradisal dream. Its hardship is its possibility. Thank you, Wendell Berry. For those of you who are just joining us today, we have a wonderful conversation about climate action, climate change, and climate justice. And I'm delighted to introduce Yassamin Ansari, who's an Arizona native, the daughter of immigrants, a graduate of Stanford and Cambridge universities, and an internationally recognized climate leader. Previously, Yassamin served as a senior climate advisor at the UN, helping to deliver the historic Paris Climate Agreement. Remember that? And leading several global climate action summits. For her work in law and policy, Yassamin was recognized by Forbes as 30 under 30 in law and policy. She currently holds a seat on the Phoenix City Council, where she recently worked to advocate and pass the city's climate action plan. So welcome, Yassamin. And then we also have Kiana Kazemi, who I just found out lives down the street from me. She's an environmental justice advocate and intersectional engineer, passionate about democratizing access to environmental education and justice-based education. She is a writer, community organizer, and entrepreneur. She's also the co-founder of Circularity, a platform and soon-to-be app that is dedicated to tackling eco-anxiety, as well as the director of programming at the Intersectional Environmentalist. So welcome to you both. Part of the reason that I wanted to host this conversation as last year we had a conversation with 3 other climate activists, one who's working in the Brazilian rainforest to do, restoration of rivers that are threatened by deforestation and dams, and a youth advocate here in Berkeley at the Brower Center, and then another person who's the head of the Chorus Foundation, which does initiatives to support communities that are trying to do climate awareness and changing the economy, local economies around climate issues. This year, I wanted to feature 2 younger people who I think are kind of coming at the problem from very different angles. So I'm delighted to have both of you. And I wonder if you could start by introducing yourself through the work that you've done around climate change, climate activism, climate justice. So I'll ask you to start, Yassamin.
Sure. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. Really excited that we were able to have this conversation today. So again, my name is Yassamin. I have been working on climate issues for not super long, but almost 10 years. And I fell into the work after I graduated from undergrad. I thought I wanted to go work, during my years at Stanford, I was studying international relations, and, I speak Farsi. So I decided I wanted to learn Arabic as well so that I could focus on the Middle East, and was actually intending to move to Turkey and work on refugee issues. And then I applied for this public service fellowship that 3 Stanford seniors and 3 Berkeley seniors are awarded every year, where you work for a senior level official for 10 months after you graduate. And I always tell this story because it really is the point in which I think my entire life changed. I was speaking with individuals around who would be my mentor, and was doing interviews, and I spoke with this individual who was at the time the Assistant Secretary General for Strategic Planning at the United Nations, leading all the climate work. And I was explaining to him, my passion for security issues and refugee and migration issues. And he's like, look, if you want to work on security, you need to be working on climate change. And there's no bigger threat to security and no bigger threat multiplier than the climate crisis, which at that point wasn't even being called the climate crisis. And come work for me, and we're working on the Paris Agreement. And I did. I found that argument very compelling. And so I went and I worked at the United Nations for the Secretary General's climate team. At that point, it was Ban Ki-moon, and got to really witness all of the political work that had to go into making the Paris Agreement happen, and helping to write talking points and do research. And as Ban Ki-moon was basically traveling the world to talk to different heads of state to try to make this happen. And one of the key things that our team worked on is broker this agreement between the US and China that ultimately helped make that a reality a year later. And from there, I became incredibly passionate about just, again, like the all-encompassing nature of the climate crisis, and the fact that it is, it affects all aspects of our lives. And so I continued on, continued working for the UN. I helped lead a couple of big climate summits over the years. So in 2016, I was the director for the Climate Action Summit in Washington, D.C., where a number of commitments were made. Similarly, in 2018, after Trump withdrew from Paris, I helped Governor Brown's team in California work with cities and states and companies to basically try to make up for it and work on different commitments. And that's actually where I became inspired by the role of cities, and realized that if we really want to have an actual impact in terms of policies and all of these commitments actually being implemented, then we need people in power at every level of government and different levels and corporations making those decisions. So that's what inspired me to run for Phoenix City Council. I jumped through a couple of things there, but basically that was 5 or 6 years right there. And then I decided to run for office. And honestly, I'm seeing that in my work today. Phoenix is the 5th largest, fastest growing city in the country. We have 8 council members plus the mayor. So it takes 5 people to pass any sort of policy. And we make decisions every single day in regards to transportation, development, new buildings, trees, shade, solar. And it's exciting to be a part of that and actually see the change since I've been elected in terms of actually talking about this issue and making decisions. And I know we'll go into that a little bit, but just a interesting trajectory, I would say, that I did not expect, but I've really liked working on this issue at the international level and now the very local level.
Thank you. That was really interesting. And Yassamin just celebrated her first year in office. So congratulations, you're still standing.
Thank you.
Kiana, thank you for being here. Can you tell us a little bit about your work and how you came to it? I know your biography is quite interesting because you didn't grow up in California. So maybe you could say a little bit. I know New Zealand is a place that's really addressing climate change probably more rapidly than many places.
Yeah, for sure. I can't say I have quite as many accomplishments and beautiful things as Yassamin has done, but I'll start with just my story really as like me, Kiana. So yeah, my name is Kiana. I use she, her pronouns. And the way I really got tapped into the environmental movement and specifically the environmental justice movement was through identity and through my passion for just connecting and storytelling with other people. And I was born and raised in Iran. When I was 8 years old, my family moved to New Zealand. And that was kind of the transition into this very, very new environment, very different culture. And I remember as like this 8-year-old, I just experienced so much culture shock. I couldn't speak English. I had no community. A lot of my values seemed to be, or the values that had been instilled in me seemed to be just very different to everyone else that I was around. And a couple of weeks into my first elementary school, I was really lonely. I was getting bullied because I didn't speak English, and I was like, just being my Iranian, like loud self, but not really knowing how to communicate with people. And so I spent a lot of lunch times alone. And one day, a couple of weeks into the school caretaker came up to me and he gave me this butterfly sticker. And he like took me to the middle of the school where this butterfly house was. And he told me, you can come here every day and you can have lunch here. And that was really my integration into the environmental club at that school. And that's how some of my first words in English were the words of sustainability and the words of conservation. And yeah, after that, my family moved around a lot more again. And everywhere I went, I was like, do you have an environmental club? And how can I join? And if you don't have one, I'm going to make my own. And so until I was around 16 years old, when I moved to the US, I had this deep passion for environmentalism, but really I wanted to focus my work around human rights because I was Iranian and that's what really mattered to me was human rights and telling the story of my people. And so when I was 16, we moved to San Diego, and that's where I started to learn about environmental justice and the language of environmental justice and what that meant, and the interconnectedness of sustainability and environmentalism with human rights and with social justice. And so from there, I became really passionate about advocating for environmental justice for communities here in the US and also for communities in the global South or in the Middle East or Iran, where my family still lives and where I have deep connections and deep roots. And so, yeah, since then, I went to Berkeley. I studied data science. And the decision I made around like why I would study data science was really because I see technology as a really big tool in, creating solutions to the climate crisis, but in a way that is representative of the people who are actually at the forefront of, the climate impacts. And so a lot of times in these engineering spaces, you see a lot of white men and a lot of people that have never experienced the very harsh realities of the climate crisis at the front lines. And so I want to be able to use these tools that I'm learning in these technical classes to be able to apply them to the environmental justice movement, and to look at technology and engineering through the framework of intersectionality or environmental justice, or these wider terms and frameworks that we use. And so since then, in the last 4 years at Berkeley, I've co-founded a company called Circularity, where we're tackling eco-anxiety, and that really came from my own personal struggles with mental health and anxiety, not just from the environmental movement, but just, you know, a person that struggles with mental health, and then the way that that's impacted by my care for the environment and our people. And then I started to work with intersectional environmentalists 2 years ago, almost a couple of weeks after it was founded. And we really concentrate on providing environmental resources and environmental education in a way that is joyful and centers communities of color, queer and trans communities, and a lot of the voices that are already creating solutions to the environmental issues that we face, but aren't often highlighted. And so there I am the programs director, where I help create and ideate our programs, and that ranges from things like a magazine that we just published to big events that we work with companies and organizations like the Sierra Club and Earth Justice, where we just held an event in New York last week. And yeah, I think that's me. I just really care about community and storytelling and the narratives that really are going to get people to take action.
Great, thank you. You are quite accomplished, I think. So that's a lot for a person who's, I don't know if you're even 22, but very intentional trajectory. So thank you for telling us a little bit about your own story. Since you talked about narrative, I want to, name the narrative that we're contending with, which is, it's a lot of bad news, right? We noted Ariana, who's our communications manager, who's helping with this Zoom event today. She and I were noting that this is probably one of the lowest registrations for events, and it's everywhere, right? The whole question of the climate crisis is omnipresent. I was noting before the two of you got on that I remember when the Hurricane Harvey happened in Texas, I just started teaching at San Francisco State. And I remember saying to myself, this is climate change, and a lot of the students, when I was kind of raising it like that, were like, no, it's just a hurricane, right? Now, I think our consciousness is no unusual weather event is happening in a vacuum. It's systemic. It's tied to larger trends around climate change. So there's a lot of bad news. And so maybe the two of you could talk a little bit about how you are dealing with that narrative in the work that you're doing, both to name it and not be in denial, but also try to frame it in ways that are productive to make things happen. Yes, I mean.
Sure. I think it's definitely a tough question. I don't know if you both watched Don't Look Up at all on Netflix, but that movie was it hit so close to home for me, just in how real I thought it was in terms of like our societies. I think we all just get so much news at our fingertips at every second that it's so easy to be desensitized, and like no one feels like they have the emotional capacity to want to take on more. I will just say, as an elected official, I try to balance my communication around climate to be more solutions oriented. And it's funny because in that movie, that's kind of one of the things that was made fun of, is the fact that we look at all these negative things as an opportunity. But I think in order to really communicate with people, someone was telling me that the formula is 1 part problem, 2 part solution, and how you should communicate about it. So I'll just say, like, locally, I talk a lot about air pollution and that side of climate and the public health impacts. So then I'm quick to couple that with, but how we address it is to focus on transportation, which is, you know, the largest source of our greenhouse gas emissions and our unhealthy air quality. And so, you know, we need to invest more in public transit, or, you know, make EVs more affordable and accessible, or make the city more walkable and bikeable. I think that's something that people can at least wrap their minds around and be excited about and be part of the solution. But when it's just the urgency and the doom and gloom, like, it's tough for anyone. I think even me, you know, now 7, 8, 9 years working on this, like IPCC report after IPCC report with the same kind of doom and gloom, you're just kind of like, okay, well, like, we know what this says. And we just need to focus on the solution and the action piece. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I guess I'll just say, like, I don't blame people, because I almost feel like I'm the same sometimes. And so I just try to focus a little bit on the tangible response.
Yeah. Thank you. No, that answers my question, because in some ways it's really key to engage people. You have to communicate with them, and you have to find a way in. And I think, Kiana, maybe you could talk a little bit about your work addressing communities of color is both responsive to a particular experience that they're having, but also it's delivering some information that is not covered often by the news, right?
Yeah. You know, I think this is such a constant struggle for anyone in this movement, is like, how do you hold on to your optimism and your hope for the future? And we were kind of talking about this before we started around radical imagination. And I think, unfortunately, with like our news cycle and with just the way that like we exist as a society, we can all list like all of the problems that exist right now. We can say, you know, capitalism and like racism and the patriarchy and all of these things which have actually led to the climate crisis exist, and here's how they impact my community, here's how they impact this community. But then when someone asks us, okay, so if you could get rid of all of those systems, what future do you want to live in, and what does that future look like? We don't necessarily know or have an answer, or, you know, have a way of how we describe that future. And so a lot of the work that I do, and the way that I like to just base my work in, is with that climate optimism approach, and with the idea of the future that we're trying to build, and actually just spending time thinking about what that future looks like for different communities. And then when you start to develop that, you realize that, okay, some of these things are really simple. I want a space where I can go and be myself and be with my community and rest and just laugh and listen to music and have access to clean food and have access to clean air and water, and just be able to, you know, exist with the people around me and have a beautiful moment. And when you think about that, if that's like a large scale future that we want to build, that's also a small scale future that we can build right now. So maybe that's just with creating a community center in my community or at my school, or maybe it's simply starting my own garden in my own backyard and having that access to the food that I want to have. And so when we start to think about it in that lens, we're able to build that future in small ways, on a small scale, locally with our local officials or with our community members. And then we're able to start to scale that, because we have our community to support us, and we start to bring in new people all the time, and they start to build their own smaller versions of that. And then all of a sudden we have a whole city that is existing in this future that we want to live in. And so for me, it's always about community. Well, a couple of my friends here are here, and a lot of the work that they do is really just about centering our experiences and centering that hope and that optimism for how we want the future to look like. And, you know, I think about this often. There's very little Iranian representation in the climate movement. And maybe that's just like in America, there are climate activists and organizers in Iran doing incredible work that I don't even know about because of just the way that the world is. And I would love to connect with them. But here, I exist in a lot of spaces with people of color, and yeah, I think sometimes it's like heartbreaking to have so little representation because, you know, the more minute you get in your identity, there are lots of ways that I could relate to my other friends from the Middle East, or even my Black and brown friends here as well, in our experiences, but no one will quite understand what it means to be Iranian American and exist in the climate space and care about these things and go to school and celebrate Nowruz. And, you know, there are so many aspects to our relationship with our environment and what we're trying to build that sometimes just don't get understood. And so creating spaces like this where we're able to talk about our identities and then our values and the work that we're trying to do, I think are really important. And the way that we can start to combat that climate doomism simply by just, yeah, talking about like what makes us hopeful for the future we're building. And then like Yassamin said, what are the solutions? How can we get together as a community to build those on a small scale? And then you'll just see like those things start to snowball and become really big really quickly, because people want them, and people just might not know how to create them. And so when you start to create them, people will get involved.
Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting to hear a little bit about your own experience. And it is one of the reasons I'm interested in trying to bring an issue like this to a place like San Francisco State that has a center. Is we don't exist in a vacuum. Our identity issues are connected, as you both have pointed out, right? Through human rights, through international relations, like all the ways in which being Iranian define us come down to some pretty universal issues. And it is really hard to get Iranians to care about this. And so I wonder if there was anything that you think specifically that, I mean, Kiana, you just said something that, like, you know, a little light bulb went off. Yeah, like our biggest holiday is a spring holiday, rebirth, the planet, going outside, right? But we haven't quite made that connection in a more pronounced political way about the connection to our planet being imperiled by climate change. So if there were some things that you would want to say to an audience of Iranians or Iranian Americans specifically, what would you want to specifically say? Without being too preachy or judgmental, right? Like turn off Shahs of Sunset and stop buying Gucci watches and fast cars. But what are some of the things that you think are grounding for your own values as an Iranian American that could be an extension to others?
Well, I think this goes to a larger point and issue that at least I have been very vocal on, which is just generally Iranian Americans. At least my impression is that most are not civically engaged. There's a very small subset of those of us who are involved in politics, understand why it's important, understand why you should get involved and vote and support financially if you can, and all of these things. So I've actually never thought about it in the light of like the climate movement. I just think about it more just overall, I think. And I'm not going to hypothesize about why, but I think it's just more, I would just focus on a more general message of why it's important for us as a community to be more engaged politically. And by politically, I just mean like on issues. And in order to advance on issues, you need to, you know, be involved in the voting process and all of the rest. So I think that's the biggest issue. I mean, it's kind of strange to me that as a, you know, what I always say is as a diaspora, we're so successful. Like we are one of the most successful diasporas financially and in terms of education and all of that. But there are very small handful of people. Like I feel like I know everyone across the country who's in some way, shape, or form politically engaged, whether they're in elected office or whether they are involved. And that's very unfortunate. I think we have a lot of work to do in that regard. And that can translate into climate as well. I mean, there's no question that climate change is, you know, the defining issue of our time, and it comes up now in political polling as well, in terms of one of the top 3 issues voters care about. So I don't think there's a question there, but I think we just have a long way to go with our community of explaining why it's important to be involved and engaged. And I think it's changing with the younger generation for sure. I definitely think, like, even, my own parents who have come a long way and are very involved in their, level, they're still skeptical sometimes. They're fearful. They have this like paranoia around being too involved and what that means and what people are saying, and just coming from a country that has gone through so much political turmoil. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see, I think, with like, I'll just put myself in Kiana's generation, what like the younger generation, I think that'll change a lot, because I don't think we have that same like innate fear in us.
Yeah, I think it's already different. Like, I see you two as, leaders, and I think that's notable that you're leaders in that conversation about climate change, but also leaders in engaging communities, whether it's in a sort of political engagement, like, in the, civic institutions like you're talking about, or in Kiana's case, where she's addressing, technology and tools, in ways that are probably more germane to her generation. So thank you for that. Kiana, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, like I said, I think about this a lot, and I don't know why it like fascinates me so much. I think maybe it's just because I work in a lot of identity-based like work. And so I don't know, I feel like there's a lot of routes I could go with my answer, but I think the biggest thing I've learned is that our people are actually environmentalists in their own right, and maybe we just don't highlight it, and maybe they don't speak the language of environmentalists right now. And the result of like a lot of those issues that we talked about, like being very, very wealthy, being very successful, having the standard of like just goods and consumerism, I think is very ingrained in us. But I think there are roots to that, and I think there's that those things are as a result of a lot of systemic things, and as a result of just things that as a diaspora we've faced historically. And I think sometimes it is important to talk about that, because it helps us as a community see the root to why we do things. And then once you see the root, you start to, because if you don't understand the root of something, you can't even begin to question it, right? And so I think understanding the roots of those issues and those tendencies helps us actually start to question them and see that there is an alternative. And I think something I think about a lot is like, my grandma in her house has always had a drawer full of plastic bags that she has kept for years. And, our entire tradition is rooted in our relationship with the environment. We have, our jumping over fires ceremony, and we tie grass to make wishes. We have all of these beautiful elements of the environment ingrained in our culture, and we relate that to success, and we relate that to family and to hope. And so I think it's honestly about changing the narrative and starting to highlight some of those ways that our communities do show up for the environment and do practice sustainability on a daily basis, things that are passed down by generations, but aren't highlighted in that language of sustainability. And I think that helps empower people. That helps empower people to take on the label of environmentalist. It helps people take on the label of politically active, because they see their community actually represented, and they see that it's not hard. It's not difficult to be a part of the community, or it's not hard to take action. Sometimes it's really simple. And so that's like one way that I think about it often, is like, what are we actually already doing? And how can we start to weave that into the language of the movement in general? And then also I think a lot about just how do we meet people where they're at? So we have a lot of engineers and we have a lot of doctors, and engineers and doctors are going to be really important for the future. Engineers are building our infrastructure. They're building our technologies for the future. And so how do we actually build a pipeline for young Iranians to not only be engineers and doctors, but be environmentalist engineers, be environmentalist doctors that understand the impact of air pollution on their patient and can then advocate for their health, or can understand that the technologies of our future will need to be with renewable resources and will need to be representative of different communities, because they understand how the work that they do is interconnected with this whole system and everything else that happens. And the future of their own children is also connected to the work that they do right now. And so I think those two things of like framing what we already do and how our identity and culture is already connected to environmentalism, and then also meeting Iranians where they're at with whatever it is that they're involved with or care about already, and how they already can start to integrate environmentalism into that work, I think is really important, and is kind of a solution to, or just like a reframing of the way we think about our community in this, in the realm of environmentalism. And so I think sometimes it's just as simple as like when you go to those just diaspora things, like when you go to like the Nowruz party, or you know, you show up for like Isco Disco, you actually like have those conversations and you start to integrate environmentalism into just everyday things, and then see where it goes from there.
Thank you. That's a really helpful way of thinking about it, reframing. Yassamin, I was wondering if you feel like you've been successful in, I mean, I know you ran as the first Iranian American woman on the Phoenix City Council. I wonder if those identity issues either have been helpful to you in speaking to people in your work, or if you've encountered even some prejudice or suspicion because of, you know, where you are in the state of Arizona, if those issues have come up for you around the identity piece.
No, so I guess like the first Iranian American thing, I guess, is probably something that the Iranian American community hears more, and I spotlight more in that regard, but it's definitely not something I like necessarily showcased when I was running.
Mm-hmm.
I actually represent a very working class Latino, like 50% Latino district, and then 60-70% Democratic as well. So I actually think a lot of people probably just thought I was Latina as well, just with my name and how I looked and everything. So no, I don't know that identity issues came up in that way. I think there was a little bit of prejudice. I mean, my campaign got pretty messy. There was city races here get very, very competitive. So I don't know if either of you know this, but
Runoff, right?
What?
There was a runoff for you, wasn't there?
There was a runoff. Yeah, there was 5 candidates and then a runoff. But then there was like a whole dark money campaign against me. Like, I wish I had the mailers on hand, but crazy things like sending to Democrats, sending mailers that made me appear as though I'm a MAGA Trump supporter.
Uh-huh.
And then to Republicans, things that were like, you know, radical liberal, And then just to say, in everything that happened, in one mailer, there was a line saying that I was a lobbyist for Iranian Americans. And I think they just pulled that from like my LinkedIn, just having been involved with different Iranian groups. So that was I think that was like the hint of like the element of like the racism and the fear that came in there. But otherwise, luckily, no, I don't think it became a big thing. I definitely the way I like try to focus on identity and just the importance of that was mostly just like connecting in terms of the story of being immigrants. Mm-hmm. And I really try to push like the importance of different minority groups and immigrant groups working together and not just like working in silos or thinking like, if I'm Iranian, I should only support Iranians, or if I'm Latina, I should only support other Latina. And I got a lot of support from a variety of different folks from different backgrounds. So I think that was pretty successful, but yeah, so it was once you start running for office, I learned that anything can happen.
Yeah.
Even never in my wildest dreams did I think that anyone would put me in the MAGA camp. But I mean, it just shows that in this day and age, like people will say whatever, even if it's like the craziest lie possible.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. So I wanted to kind of return to something you talked about, Kiana, about eco-anxiety. I feel that. I know what you're talking about. I read the article somebody wrote about you and another activist, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what it is. And you mentioned that you're working on an app about that, and I know it's been a part of your social media presence is to give language to that experience. And I guess one of the things that I also am really interested in is, you know, the channeling of those feelings into action is such a difficult, you know, thing, because people get either crippled by denial or they get crippled by like depression. Like my son he's 19 and he's like, you know, what's my future for my children, you know, and I don't really know exactly how to answer that. And so I feel some of his eco-anxiety. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I can talk about eco-anxiety forever. I mean, eco-anxiety is really defined as mental health symptoms that can look like anxiety or depression or exhaustion or feeling overwhelmed or sad as a result of the climate crisis. And there's research that shows that a huge percentage of youth now experience this, something like 65% of youth around the world are experiencing this, and portrays some level of feeling overwhelmed about what the future will look like. And as someone that is, you know, thinking about like my future and if I want to have kids or if I want to buy a house and where I want to buy that house, not that it's possible for me to buy a house in the Bay Area right now, but some of those questions that I think around this age people start to think about have all of these layers of now overwhelming fear and uncertainty that no generation before us has had. And so that experience of, you know, I realized that this was something I was feeling. The more I talked to the people around me, I realized that everyone around me was also experiencing that. And then, you know, top that off with a pandemic and climate doom all the time and just school shootings. And there's just so much around us that's systemic, that's happening, that a lot of times it feels like we have no power over. And so I started to do a lot of research around, okay, so eco-anxiety exists, youth are experiencing it predominantly, what can we actually do about it? What are the solutions? And there's still very little research around it, and it's something that is being researched a lot more today. And I think some of the first papers around it are coming out like just now. But it seems that through the research, there are 4 ways that eco-anxiety can be tackled. One is through environmental education and really understanding what are the issues that we face and having language around the environmental crisis. 2 is knowing how to take action, and action that isn't just personal and doesn't put the weight of everything on you, but action that's community-centric and is also on a more system-wide level. So how do I take like political action that goes beyond just my personal shopping? And then 3rd is more traditional forms of therapy. So like things like going to therapy, meditation, journaling, things that are a little bit more reflective and really help you like think inwardly about your positionality and the ways that, you know, you can take action. And then 4th is community, and community is really the most important one, tied together with action. And so these 4 ways are really how researchers are saying we can start to develop tools for eco-anxiety And so I was like, okay, so there has to be a way that we can loop in these 4 things and start to provide a hub, a central hub for tackling eco-anxiety for youth. And that's where Circularity was born, which is really an idea around how do we make these 4 things accessible to anyone and make sure that everyone has access to these 4 things in order to start not only taking care of their mental health, but the beautiful thing about it is that it actually also empowers people to take action and empowers people to build community. And so our work at Circularity has been, it's not just our app is in development, and that really came from my engineering background, but it's also around programming and events and resources that help people start conversations in their own communities. So we recently published a book that's a guide to environmental advocacy, and it has a lot of those journal prompts. We're about to publish another one that's called A Guide to Community Resilience, and it's around building resilience in your own community and starting really small and then building out, like I was talking about before. So yeah, those are kind of like that's the work that we've been doing around eco-anxiety. And I think framing it in the solution, like, yes, this is a problem and here's how we can actually tackle it, is really helpful, and has just allowed us to create a lot of resources and build a lot of momentum around the idea as well.
Thank you. That sounds really like a useful app I would put on my phone. So I want to maybe swing back to you, Yassamin, and ask, you know, part of the struggle of people in political office is to make the case for the cost of things, the cost to transitioning from you know, fossil fuels to other things. Or right now, you know, the question in Washington, D.C. is not only are we not going to pass a Green New Deal, but now we're talking about further expanding fossil fuels to, you know, deal with the crisis in Ukraine and the fallout from that, and releasing strategic fuel reserves. How do we manage the question of the cost of things with the sort of psychological, you know, reasoning, which is in some ways how you're addressing it, Kiana, is to sort of think about the emotional costs. How do you deal with the actual economic costs, and to make people understand the long term versus the short term? I hope that was.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the last piece of what you just said is exactly that. So I've had to deal with this already a couple of times. And, you know, I'm someone who very much focuses on the numbers and looking at the research, and pretty much in everything I've experienced so far. Obviously, you know, with I'll use electric vehicles as an example. While the average cost of an EV is still more than the average cost of a gas-powered vehicle, when you look at life cycle costs for the consumer, you will save money. But also when you look at the larger scale, like public health costs, for example, and the healthcare costs that we have from pollution and asthma and lung cancer and all of the consequences, that just takes it above and beyond, and it's much easier to make the case. But yeah, I've already faced this issue. So a couple of months into starting last fall, I learned, so to give some context, every single week when we have a formal council meeting, we get a binder this big with like hundreds of items that we're voting on. Most of the items there, so that's anything that the city spends money on or has to make an amendment to a contract comes to council. So all that to say that hundreds of things just go on consent, and it's beyond any reasonable person and the small teams that we do have to be able to like get into the weeds of every single thing. But in one meeting, my team discovered that we were getting into a contract for up to 5 years, up to $145 million to replace hundreds of our aging city buses with compressed natural gas buses. So we kind of freaked out, started going into things like, meanwhile, we have just passed our climate plan, right? And I'm the chair of our city's electric vehicle ad hoc committee that we have like so many senior staff members on, tons of work is being put into it. So we're like, why would we possibly invest in replacing hundreds of buses with fossil fuel powered buses if we're doing all this work? So it just kind of shows, as an example though, the the different silos and the fact that it's not going back to what Kiana said in terms of like engineers and different people who are just thinking this way, like that's clearly not happening yet. And that's what we need to get to. But so we started doing a ton of work around working with staff and council and the mayor. And anyway, ultimately, I'll just say good news. We did not go through with that contract. And we ultimately have now put out an RFP to look into electric buses and hybrid electric buses. But one of the big things that even our own city departments would tell us is, but the cost, like these buses cost double the amount than these, ones we always use. And it's just, I just like, at least on this issue, I will say it's tough on every issue to like, because there's just so many things systemically that we need to change. On this issue, I'm relentless in just that, making the case for why, first of all, the cost piece, like if you look at everything, I still think the cleaner options are better cost-wise. But regardless, I think it's one of the areas that you just have to keep pushing and saying, like, you have to look at the long term, you have to look at the societal consequences, the public health costs, and then again, life cycle costs, especially right now with gas prices being so high, it's a little bit easier to make that point and show like, look, ultimately this is better for the consumer. And again, as technology improves, 6 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now, it's going to be a different story when it comes to the cost of all of these things. So yeah, it's just, having to continue to make the case and focus on the benefits and why it's so much more important. I will say, I think I'm feeling more optimistic lately because I'm seeing, at least in my bubble of like Phoenix, we have seen bipartisan support for clean energy and these votes. I sit on the city's public safety and justice subcommittee. So everything comes through a subcommittee before going to the full council. And we just recently got a presentation about electric fire trucks. And the chair of the committee is Republican, and she was very excited about it. And actually, the first thing her team said to me was, we asked for the data because yes, it's $1 million. I think it's 1.6 million is the cost of one electric bus, as opposed to 800K for a normal or electric fire truck. And they want to see the data because they agree that, long term, though, with fuel costs for the truck and all of that over 20 years, that may help the city save money. So I think that cost actually can end up being a way to sway people, especially people who may not be on the same page ideologically, but may come to the same conclusion because of that route. And when you look at like taxpayer savings and the rest.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'm mindful of the time and it's 5 o'clock. So I want to see if anybody in the audience would like to ask a question, and you can turn on your screen and, or you can raise your hand if you want. I'll happily keep pitching a few more questions, but I also want to make sure that if anyone else would like to offer a question, you feel free to do so. Okay, I don't see any hands. I'll just wait for anybody to chime in. So the other thing I want to ask is a little bit about, you both have spoken a lot about community, both in the sort of ways in which you both represent and want to represent your communities, either where you live or in your sort of Iranian diaspora context. And I wonder if you feel that there's something that we meaning me in the center, or we in the sort of more collectivist Iranian sensibility can actually do to become a little bit more savvy about participating in this issue. And I don't, I host this conversation because I want to model for people that, like, hey, there's these really bright young women who are doing really important work, and I want to say, like, all the work that I'm doing in the center doesn't matter a lick if we're not paying attention to the larger context of the world that we're living in. But aside from that, I often, I do things individually. So I'm thinking a little bit about, like, what are some of the collectivist ways that we can sort of mobilize our Iranian diaspora community? And you mentioned education being one, Kiana, but are there other things that you think are urgent?
Yeah, like I said, I was born in Tehran, and I grew up there for first 8 years of my life, and a lot of my family still lives in Iran. And the air pollution in Tehran is probably one of, it's like right at the top with like some of the most polluted cities in the world. And I don't know if that's something people really think about, like thinking about the ways that environmental harms are actually experienced in Iran with their own people and their own families. And so I think something that we can do a better job of is simply just telling stories and sharing the narratives of our family members, of our community members in Iran who are actually experiencing environmental harms, because I think that's also another way of informing people on like how their people are actually experiencing the climate crisis. And I think there's an important way of like going about that, because I don't want to be, pushing the narrative of like climate doom and making people more stressed and making people feel worse. But I think there needs to be a balance of like understanding that there are people in Iran that are dying from like air pollution, people that are experiencing extreme weather impacts. There's like the water crisis in the Middle East is like one of the worst crises in the world right now, and no one really talks about that. And the fact that environmental crises like water and oil actually lead to so many wars, lead to so many conflicts, I think like these are all perspectives that we need to start highlighting in all of the realms that we exist in. Like when we talk about war, why aren't we talking about oil? And why aren't we talking about the harms and the imperialism that has happened in Iran as a result of having access to oil? So I think we need to just start talking about the things that Iranian people are facing as a result of the climate crisis, and then also start to talk about the solutions that they're creating, because Iranians are some of the most innovative people that I know, and they literally made maths and like so many other, beautiful, cool things in the world, and are so smart and are so like creative and beautiful and making art and making huge community impacts. So why is there no central hub for us to see the beautiful creative work that Iranians do? Like I'm looking for it. I'm always looking for like designers, sustainable Iranian designers. Like where can I find them? And how can I support their work? Because I know that they exist, but there's just no central hub for us to find each other. And so I think we need to start being better about supporting that kind of work and also highlighting that kind of work and just sharing narratives when it comes to sustainability and Iranian identity, because we do that really well when it comes to like other narratives, when it comes to like success stories and how smart we are and all of those things.
Yeah.
But like where are our environmental narratives? And everyone has like someone in their family that does something like that. So I think if we all started to just highlight each other a little bit more, and unfortunately, I think there's a little bit of like competitiveness in our like group of people, which I don't necessarily see in a lot of other like cultural identities. And I think that needs to go away, and we need to support each other more and know each other more and connect with each other more. And it really starts that way, because once you meet a couple other Iranian people near you, like locally, that are doing this kind of work, we all have so many ideas, and we just need like people to make them into a reality. If we want to run for office, like how cool is it to have an entire team of like Iranian people to like do everything from like style you to like be your campaign manager to like all of those things? Or if you want to build a garden, why aren't you like limu shirin? Why aren't you growing limu shirin? Or like there are so many ways that we can start to weave our identity into the work that we do. And I think it's all about narrative. Like narrative is just so important. And I think that's like the biggest action people can start to take in our community, is to change the narrative about our relationship with sustainability.
Thank you. That was very interesting. A hub is a really great idea. Okay, Savannah has a question. Since climate justice and restoration is global, do any of you identify or relate to other environmental struggles like indigenous efforts in the Americas? And then after that, I think Varsha has a question. So don't know if that speaks to either one of you. The connection to other environmental struggles like indigenous efforts in other places in the Americas.
I mean, I think there's like a lot of similarities between different environmental struggles. I actually think Kiana touched on the Iran one very, very well, because it's interesting. In Arizona, I feel that we have pretty much the exact same environmental struggles that Iran does, whether it's pollution, drought, heat. And so that is definitely very, very relatable. I think there can be more of connection and speaking to one another. I will say, like, one of the things I did in a previous life, my last piece of work at the UN was putting on the first ever UN Youth Climate Summit. We brought like 1,000 young people from 140 different countries to New York to literally talk about what they're working on, the various struggles, the solutions they're working on, gave the different opportunities to engage with political decision makers, corporate decision makers. And I think, like, I have continued to this day to hear positive feedback about just like the connection. And I know there's a lot of communication that goes on with the youth climate movement, which I think is amazing. But yeah, I think it's definitely an opportunity. I think young people are doing it phenomenally in terms of communicating with one another, following each other's work. I mean, I know some of like the most prominent climate activists. It feels weird saying that, but I know it's like a whole thing now. You know, some of them met each other online, you know, whether it's like Greta Thunberg meeting climate activists from Uganda and other countries. Like, they first connected on the internet and then, you know, learn about each other's struggles and then have met in person and vice versa.
Yeah, I think also the other really interesting thing is that you're so close to the border of the US-Mexico border, and many of the people who are trying to get into the United States from the southern border where you are people who are fleeing both gang violence or state violence, but also climate problems that have made food production really difficult, you know, or usurpation of land by the state of Mexico in these indigenous communities. So it's hard not to connect to those. And the woman who spoke last year, what's her first name? Sultani is her last name. Gosh, she founded Amazon Watch, and was interesting because she talked about like her awareness of environmentalism as a child in Iran, right? Same kind of thing that you're talking about, Kiana, both the cultural narratives about valuing nature, but also experiencing going to places that had been these, you know, very productive valleys where food was grown, and then seeing over her childhood how drastically they changed as a result of drought. So some of these communities that grow pistachios, for example, and going back there as a teenager and realizing like these places are running out of water, so they can't produce food in the same way. I want to make sure that Varsh gets to ask the question. So do you want to speak it or write it? Are you still there?
I think it was typed in the chat.
Oh, I'm sorry. Missed it. Oh, how do you personally take care of yourself and practice wellness in the face of eco-anxiety or political anxiety in your case?
I don't know. I can try to answer this, but I don't think I do a good job. And I'm currently sick, which is just proof of being burnt out. Honestly, when I'm at my best version of taking care of myself, it's consistently exercising and just dedicating a little bit of time every day, even if it's just to like walk on the treadmill. And also quality time with good friends. I find that I'm someone who, although I like when I'm in a bubble of people, so when I like worked at the UN or now when I'm working at City Hall, I tend to want to only hang out with those people that I've become friends with in those contexts because I feel like they're the only ones who get it and we speak the same language and like they understand my day-to-day struggles. But then I actually have realized that that is one of the negative parts of why sometimes my mental health isn't the best that it can be, because that's all I'm ever talking about. And even like my free time and my social time is talking about work or the stresses that come with work. Whereas if I focus on spending time with a good friend from high school, we don't even touch on those things. You know, we just say, yeah, work is this, da, da, da. But then we talk about different things. We laugh. Like it's way more stress relieving than it is to do the work social piece. So I think sometimes getting out of my own world and like prioritizing the relationships that have been around my whole life and have nothing to do with the work that I'm doing is the best way that I have been able to help myself in terms of anxiety issues.
Kiana?
Yeah, I think I would just echo all of that. I think for me too, it's just finding, I think movement is just so important in a lot of ways. Like getting it really like lets you physically, like you can't be on your phone or you can't like, you have to like actually concentrate on like a certain movement. And so it stops you from like thinking so hard about a lot of things or even like helps you think through things. So I think that's a big one for me too. And I've also been sick for like 3 months now and I just don't rest. And so it just like keeps getting worse and worse. And I just took antibiotics and still, I'm like still a little bit sick. So I really understand the burnout. And I think it's something that a lot of youth activists experience as well. It's just like this constant on top of, you know, doing like the traditional things that you're told to do, like go to school, get a degree, get a job, have time to socialize, find a partner, do these things that are like normalized in society. But then on top of that, you're like, you have to fight for your community, the survival of your community, the survival of your culture, your language, your literal environment. Like it's really overwhelming and really exhausting. And I think for me, it's a balance of like quality time with friends and then also quality time by myself. I think something I've realized is like, I really need to spend time by myself in order to recharge my social battery and also like really have time to create too. I think sometimes like being a creative person, like we're all creative in our own ways. And when we stifle that creativity, whatever it is, when we stifle it, we just get really burned out because we're constantly producing for like the sake of productivity or the sake of like something else. And we don't set aside time to create for our own sake, to write, to take photos of our family members. And I think a lot of my personal anxiety comes from actually not taking care of myself and not taking care of my family. My grandparents live in New Zealand with my parents, and even when I go back to New Zealand, I find I have no time to actually spend time with my grandparents, and I'm like you're just bringing your work with you to this new place. Instead of actually existing in this place with the people that you love. And when you're not there, you're constantly thinking about them. So why can't you just like actually spend time with these people that you miss all the time? And so I think being really intentional about the time that we spend with people and ourselves and how we do that is really important and has helped me a lot. And I'm not good at it, but at least I'm trying to pinpoint it and like catch myself when I start to think about work, or when I have like time for myself blocked on my calendar and I'm like, oh, I'll have another meeting here. So just a little bit more intentionality. I think I'm trying to like manifest that for myself. And I think, I don't know, I hope it's helpful to others too.
Yeah, I also just want to say spending time in nature is probably the biggest cure for eco-anxiety, because you're it's so captivating. So during the pandemic, I walked every single day down by the bay, and I don't go as much, but I still do that. And I think especially the thing that you love, which is the planet and Mother Nature and, you know, the world that we're trying to protect, you have to go participate and let it feed you too. So I hope you do that, both of you. I know it's not easy when you have a demanding schedule, but and I do think one of the hazards of the pandemic has been this idea that we can work anywhere, right? I don't know, it sounds like both of you have that anyway, but I think the pandemic has made us feel like everything is portable and we can just take it with us. And I find myself saying, wow, I really need to decompress and turn it off. Because even though I can go on a Zoom call, I don't want to, you know? So any other questions before we close this out? We're almost at the end of our time, and I want to make sure that if you have any comments or questions, you address them to these wonderful speakers. And I'm so impressed by both of you, both because you've started so young and also because you're doing such important work and modeling, I think, you know, for future generations, but also for Iranian Americans. It's hard to be sort of in the pioneering frame that you guys are both, you two are both doing, but it's so important. And believe it or not, just I think modeling is remarkably effective. So thank you for all your good work. Okay, any closing thoughts that you two have for folks that might be wanting to get plugged in? I mean, I don't know if you want to say anything about the intersectional environmentalist. I've watched a few of your, it's primarily an online community, right?
Yeah, it's been mostly online. We started during the pandemic, so mostly online so far, but we actually just launched our like big in-person programs last week. So definitely doing more in-person things now that the world is a little bit more opened up.
So you can find it like is there a website?
Yeah, you can find it on Instagram, Intersectional Environmentalist, and our website is also Intersectional Environmentalist. And then if you want to support circularity, we have a lot of events in the Bay Area, and that's Circularity Community on Instagram. And then I think my last thought is just that, I don't know, I think a lot about like my ancestors, and I think a lot about, like I was saying, like my mom and my grandma and the many, many Iranian women that came before me, and their grace and their power and their wisdom. And I think about that a lot, and it inspires me a lot because they faced their own struggles in many different ways, and they had to humble themselves in many different ways, and yeah, do a lot that, you know, that hadn't been done before. And so I root a lot of my work in the values that they had, and I hope that we can be proud of our ancestors and the work that they did, and the hardships that they had to face, while also just question maybe the things that they didn't do right, but always very like have so much love for the Iranian community. And yeah, it's always beautiful to be with others and that share language and culture together. So feeling very grateful.
Thank you. Thank you. So Savannah asked a little bit about your social media platforms. You mentioned Intersectional Environmentalist, but I found Kiana online through her own personal account. So yes, you have an Instagram page also, and Yassamin's, she put in the chat. I follow both of you, and I think, you know, the work that you're doing on the city council is like so admirable, because it's a hard time to be a elected public official, and there's so much hostility towards Democrats in particular, but I think, you know, you're kind of on the front line, so thank you for that good work.
Thank you. And thank you so much for hosting this conversation. It was awesome to be able to talk to both of you. And Kiana, I hope I'm in the Bay Area every once in a while. I have a lot of family there, so would love to connect in person. And I hope we can do more of this. I think, you know, going back to what you talked about earlier, Perseus, in terms of like how to bring this in, I would love to bring more. I think there's already at least some outlets, obviously, with like Iranian American Women's Foundation and just the different groups that host events now that events are coming back. And I think maybe bringing a little bit more pitching, I don't know, maybe it's about pitching conversations about climate change and what people can do in those forums, at least that already exist, would be a good start to kind of at least get our diaspora more engaged on this issue.
I'm going to an IAWF event tonight, so I'm gonna
Oh, really?
mention it if I see
Nice.
I am there. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We have to sort of like make the bridge a little bit more solidly
Yeah.
to understand that like all your, you know, career success needs to be also linked to some, you know, bigger conversation about the sustainability of the work that we all want to see go far beyond our own lives. So
Yeah.
thank you for that suggestion. Okay, well, thank you again. Thanks to our audience, who are those little black boxes with names on it. Jana, Savannah, Nicole, thank you for coming. And thank you also to Nick and Ariana, who are working with me. Oh, and Kamran too. Sorry, I forgot you. Yeah, it's really nice to meet both of you, and I really appreciate all your hard work and vision. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Excited to stay
Bye.
connected. Bye,
Definitely.
everyone.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.